Just because you don't know what the condition is doesn't necessarily prove it's unconditional. You have to get that from Romans 9 and Ephesians 1, your interpretation of those things, which if you just come out and admit that, then that's fine. But to pretend like it's in this text is what's it's got to be called out. You can't just presuppose it. You've got to establish it from this text.
So let me pull this Bible up here. So to emphasize what Leighton and I have said, so what James White says, he goes to 37. Let me pull it up here. And he says, this is the explanation for why they don't believe. And what he means, of course, what he's doing is presupposing the T and the U and saying, well, obviously they're born God haters by nature. And so the explanation by Jesus for the reason they won't believe is just because the Father did not unconditionally choose them, which it doesn't say. So, and then Leighton said earlier, no, he is rebuking them. I agree with that. Jesus is saying, God's going to give me a people. You are not going to be it because you don't believe in me. I think that's exactly what he's saying. And so we got to ask the question, which is favored by the scriptures? What White assumes, the T and the U of tulip, or what Leighton and I have been saying. And let's look at this. Now, earlier he says this, do not work for the food which perishes, which he's just accommodating their efforts here of trying to seek him for the food. And he's using this parabolic language. And then he says, labor for the food which endures to eternal life. And so he's actually telling them, this is what you need to work for. And then he says, this is the work of God that you believe. Now he's talking, Leighton, to the same people. And he's saying the work of God is for you to believe. And so I say that the text favors, I mean, if you're just looking at this section, I mean, me and Leighton went to John 5, we went to John 1. But if you're just looking at this small section and this discourse, our view is much more favored by the text, because what you have to do is you have to see that Jesus has already said the work of God is for them to believe. But then what sense does it make for him to turn around later and say, let me tell you why you don't believe? It's because he doesn't want you to believe. Well, he just said God's work is for them to believe.
Right. So this is the work that God requires. And even John Calvin, by the way, agrees with our estimation of that, because some Calvinists will take that and say, see, that's the work of God. That means that's the effectual work of God to cause the elect to believe. And even John Calvin doesn't go that far. What Jesus is saying is, this is the work that God requires. What's the work that God requires? For you not to be able to earn by meriting your salvation, but the work that God requires is not a work at all. It's for you to trust in his work. It's for you to put your trust in him. That's the thing that he requires, is you to trust in him. So that's what he's talking about there. And notice that he even says, and I point this out in the text in verse 32, that the bread is given to you. He uses the pronoun you there, and he's talking to a bunch of unbelievers. So why would he say the bread's given to you if some of the people in the crowd are reprobates? Is the bread given to reprobates? On 5-point Calvinism, no, it's not given to reprobates. So why would he say the bread of life is given to you if some of the people in the crowd are reprobates? Because the bread of life wouldn't be given to them.
That's right. And so I think a person has to look at it and say, which one of these views is most favored by the text? And I think that it is just, Calvinism is very unconvincing because of these types of things, even in just isolating this section, because Jesus says, this is the work of God for you to believe, but then he turns around and says, but he doesn't really want you to believe, and that's why you don't believe in me. Now, there's no reason I should believe that without some really clear statement in there that a Calvinist would need, and then say, God has given you the true bread from heaven, but God doesn't really want you to eat of it. No, that's not convincing to me.
Yeah, and by the way, he's not obligated to give that true bread. That is grace. God gives grace by sending Jesus. God gives grace by sending the gospel. That is God's grace. It's not effectual in that he's causing certain people to receive it or not, like the Calvinists would say, but that is his gracious provision. And he's also gracious to regenerate those who do believe. He doesn't have to do that either. That's also gracious. And so for people to deny that we're talking about God's grace, or that this is, for us, it's not about God's grace at all or whatever else. No, the only difference between our views is that you think God's grace is effectual for the elect, and we think that God's grace is provisional for everyone. And those who choose to follow the provision they made, just like look to the serpent so as to be healed. So to look to Christ so as to be healed, that is the provision of the atonement. And he's not obligated to send the serpent on the pole, just like he's not obligated to send Jesus. That's gracious. And he's not obligated to save those who look to the serpent. That's gracious of him to do that. Just like he's not obligated to regenerate those who look to the Son, but he chooses to do that. That's a gracious thing of the Father to do.
Yeah, and it sounds like a good argument at first to say, like someone said there, you're denying God's effectual grace. Well, no, we deny that the Bible teaches that God's grace is irresistible in regeneration. That's the point.
Correct.
It's like, well, faith is a gift. Absolutely. But gifts can be rejected. I mean, it's a gift whether you accept it or deny it or not. I mean,
right. And God should get the credit for even those who reject his gift. He should get credit for giving gifts to those people who reject it. He should still get credit for that.
Oh, yeah. In fact, he gets more credit. I mean, if they're rejecting it, it just shows him to be more gracious because he is offering it. So it's absolutely, and it's the same thing with, well, if you can choose to believe, you're saving yourself. No, Paul the Apostle contrasts merit through works with faith. So faith in Paul's theology, and I'll tend to agree with him, is not merit. It's when your faith actually says something about the object of your faith. It says your faith is good because God is good, because you're believing in him.
Yep.
All right. So if you got no further comments on that, what I like to do now is play something from White's first rebuttal. And this, I think we'll do more with John 44, and we can kind of touch on that. So let me pull it up.
Says all the one coming to, by the way, exactly what I said would take place. Fairly obvious. If fundamental assertion that was made 3 or 4 times, but never substantiated by any exegetical assertion whatsoever. And by the way,
I got to say,
this, by the way, that he's about to say, this, by the way, is what I was referring to earlier. And he's about to establish that if the T is true and the I is true, then what's implied is the U. So he's about to say what I was referring to earlier, just so people are aware.
Yeah. And he says that you didn't try to substantiate it whatsoever. Well, that's just debate tactic, because whether he agrees, even if you were wrong in your conclusions, you were in John 5, you were in John 1. So things like that,
if no one is able to come to the Son,
let me back it up a bit.
If no one, the one coming to me, I will never cast out. We don't have time to expand. And here's where the debate is this evening. What you just heard, the fundamental assertion that was made 3 or 4 times, but never substantiated by any exegetical assertion whatsoever. And by the way, if no one is able to come to the Son except drawn by the Father, and those that are drawn by the Father are raised up by the Son, that's unconditional election. I didn't think I needed to repeat that type of thing. It was fairly obvious from the beginning.
And that's untrue.
Isn't that question begging?
No, well, it's also untrue, because you can be given by the Father to the Son and actually raised up on the last day and still be consistent with my view, which is what I said in the cross-examination. I explained that to him. You don't have to have unconditional election in order to get there, because he could be conditionally giving to the Son those who have believed and followed him, and they would be raised up in the last day. So it does not establish unconditional election. He just claims that it does, but never shows that it does. Never exegetically or even philosophically. He never makes any argument in his opener or in any other time in the debate that those two things are automatically, in other words, a non sequitur, that no one is able to come unless drawn by the Father, and those drawn will be raised up. I can affirm all 3 of those things and still not hold to unconditional election. And he doesn't even seem to recognize that. Michael Brown made the same argument. Steve Gregg made the same argument. John Lennox made the same argument, all in James White's hearing. And he still hasn't yet to grasp it well enough to even contend with our point of contention.
Yeah, and that's why I said question begging, because the question is, okay, we realize he's going to raise up on the last day those who come, and nobody can come unless drawn. But the question is, on what basis does God draw? Well, if you assume, it's an unconditional basis before creation, but that's the point. It is a presupposition.
You have to debate it. You have to establish that. You can't just claim it.
Yeah, and if all you were looking at is that verse, a person could say, okay, well, maybe he draws everybody with blonde hair and blue eyes. You could put all kinds of things in there if you're going to presuppose things. You could presuppose conditions just as much as you could presuppose that there aren't any conditions.
You could presuppose unknown conditions, mysterious conditions, which you could find out when we can all get to heaven and find out that there's some genetic randomizer that God used in order to choose those who would be elect or not. And you would say, okay, well then that was the condition based upon a genetic makeup of materials or whatever it is. And we just now found out about it, once this life is over and we get to heaven, we find out this is the condition God used, this divine lottery in a sense. And just because you don't know what the condition is, doesn't necessarily prove it's unconditional. You have to get that from Romans 9 and Ephesians 1, your interpretation of those things, which if you just come out and admit that, then that's fine. But to pretend like it's in this text is what's, it's got to be called out. You can't just presuppose it. You've got to establish it from this text.
Yeah, because John 6 and this verse 44 in particular are supposed to be these big proof texts, and it is, but everything is based upon the presupposition in the first place. And if your proof text isn't a proof text without the presupposition, then it isn't a proof text. So, all right, let me go back to it.
Here is the assertion. What Dr. Flowers just did is exactly what I said would take place. You begin at verse 45, you assign it a meaning, and then you read it backwards into the text.
Which I didn't do.
Right. And it's very interesting. Now, first of all, even if you had, now you didn't, but even if you had, I mean, Leighton, there's not a problem with that anyway, if it is true, if it were true that a later information brings clarity to previous information. And so even if you had, it isn't necessarily false. I mean, does the later information provide clarity to things that are said earlier? I mean, that happens all the time. I mean, what would be the problem with that anyway?
Well, and even James White's dealing with John 1:12. To all who receive him, they give him the right to become children of God. What does he do? He reads the next verse back into it, saying, "Oh, see, they're born of God," and he reads that, of course, as being unconditionally born of God, meaning regeneration, and that's why they receive him. So what's he doing? He's reading verse 13 back into verse 12 in order to establish his theology. And there's several other examples of this. We went over another program where James White does this same kind of thing, where he'll read a verse later down in order to bring clarity to a verse that seems to be contradictory to Calvinism earlier. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, what's ironic about that, like you said, even if I'd done it, he still needs to contend with the view, not just say, this is what my opponent did, therefore I don't have to contend with his view. That's what he did in Romans 9 too. Well, my opponent jumped around to all over the place and never exegeted it, therefore I don't have to answer his arguments. That's again his MO. My opponent didn't use the methodology that I think's appropriate, therefore I don't have to deal with his arguments. And that's not good debate. That's really, and this is one of the best debaters from the Calvinistic side, and yet he's not contending with the arguments. That's one of the reasons after the debate on Romans 9, I went and played Emilio Ramos and Sean Cole and Date and others who all had broadcast afterwards saying, I know White said that Leighton didn't exegete the text, and you can argue whatever you want to about that, but I want to actually deal with what Leighton argued, what his points were. And then they would go through the broadcast, and I was like, thank you. I mean, you even, AK, can contend with my methods and think I should do something a different order or a different way. I don't have a problem with that. I do the same thing when I critique other people's debates. The problem is when you do that in order not to deal with the argument they're making. That's the problem. It's like, I'm not going to deal with this argument, even though I know what the argument is, because the method that he brought this argument to pass is not to my liking. That's not good debate. It's really poor argumentation.
And it's just poor exegesis anyway, or logic, because that's a common thing, is to even be talking to somebody or reading something, and then something you hear later clarifies previous things. And if the text is calling for that or provides that, there's nothing wrong with it. And I just got to say, James White, you said he does this. It's exactly what it is. I got a clip here. It's a 30-second clip of him doing that very same thing. Just to establish that everybody does that, and there's nothing wrong with it. So this is a clip actually from him talking about two humanities in Romans 5. He's dealing with people that object to federal headship. He's quoted Romans 5, and then he's got some comments about how to understand it. And this is what he's
one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners. So by the one man's obedience, the many will be made righteous. Now, obviously, the last few verses The conclusion has to shed light upon the questions that come up in the exegesis of the verses beforehand. And my experience, limited as it might be, but getting up to 3 decades now, my experience is that people who have a problem with this particular text focus upon the first few verses rather than listening to what the conclusion is.
So White's saying you're going to be
what's
misled.
Good for you, what's good for you is not good for me. It's basically hypocrisy. Yeah, you've got to look at the conclusion, which is my Romans 9 stuff too. You look at the conclusion of verse 32 and following, Paul's own conclusion remarks of what he was meaning in chapter 9, and Dr. White never even discusses the end of chapter 9 in our debate. And that's what I started with. And I get criticized because I started with the end, because that's where he left off. And that's the problem, is when you're reading through any text, yes, what he says there is exactly right. You must read all of the text in its entirety, and its conclusion, what it draws out, needs to help inform its meaning throughout. Absolutely. But again, if I do that, then it's just bad exegesis, and therefore I don't have to address his arguments or any of those kinds of things. It's pure hypocrisy.
Yeah. And it is absolutely, it's like the New Testament provides clarity on the Old Testament just because it's further revelation, that kind of thing. So
exactly.
But he repeats, I had to play that clip because he repeats that quite, I think he even did it in his rebuttal about how you're reading stuff backwards. And you didn't.
That was really his only argument. His only argument against everything I said was that basically my opponent's reading it backwards, which, by the way, is not new. He said the same thing to Steve Gregg. He said the same thing to Michael Brown. He said the same thing after reading John Lennox's book. It's not, he doesn't deal with the argument. He just criticizes the methodology, whether it's true or not. Whether I actually did start with verse 44 and read it back into it or not, he still never deals with the actual argument, which should be suspect to those who are watching this objectively. You should think, why in the world is he not dealing with what Leighton is saying, and instead just saying, well, I don't have to deal with it because he did it backwards.
Yeah, and now what he did at one point, he asked you in the Q&A, I mean, I'm skipping ahead here, but I just got to say, because you talk about not dealing with the argument. Now, what he asked you a question in the Q&A, basically, and this is in my words, because I can't remember how he worded it, but he said, if all my presuppositions are true, wouldn't that make my view right? And you said, yeah, that will make your view right. And then at the end, he said, the debate ended right there. So if I
tautology,
assume...
winning by tautologies. If I'm right, am I right? Yes. If you're right, you're right. Oh, therefore I win. So I'm just like, that's a presuppositionalist for you, right?
Right. It's asking if Calvinism's presuppositions about the passage are true, then aren't our conclusions true? Well, but that's the whole debate. That's the whole point. But
that's exactly right.